Before I introduce our keynote speaker for the symposium, I do recognize that there are a few faces who haven't been here for the entire weekend. So I do want to point out that if you are at all interested in these books or in any Atlantic Canadian children's books or an illustration in general, and you haven't had a chance to go across the hall to see the art exhibit of Atlantic Canadian picture book art, which features the paintings by Darka, Erdelji, and some of the puppets that have been used in the Jack Tales that will be talked about today. That's just across the hall, and it will be open after the talk today. All right, I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker, and I'm going to make Andrea pause on her way down here because in a story about child, youth, and place in Atlantic Canadian literature, there's a bit of a story of growing up to be told here. In the fall of 1990, there were three young women who we were very young, younger than that, women who first encountered each other at the University of Alberta. And it's just dawning on us now that this fall is the 25th anniversary of Andrea and Teya and myself meeting each other. And at the time, Andrea was an emigre from Atlantic Canada. I had never lived in Atlantic Canada, and Teya, of course, is originally from the Rock and has traveled many, many places since then. So it's very exciting for us to be able to come together 25 years later when we're all working in the field. We all have strong roots in Atlantic Canada now, and our friendships have never once waned in the 25 years. So I get all weepy when I think about it. But to get on to our guest speaker, Teya Rosenberg has been working in the field of children's literature for longer than the time period in which I have known her. She did her PhD at the University of Alberta, studying with Raymond Jones, and then moved on to Southwest Texas State University in San Marcos. And I also have the claim to fame of taking her there to help her find her first house. So we go way back. Teya works in a wide range of areas of children's literature, but she has a specialist focus in magic realism and fantasy and has done lots of work on the novels of Diana Wynne Jones. But she also has this draw that brings her back to Newfoundland sometimes every other year, as often as she can, and she does the car migration from Southwest Texas back to St. John's, where she is still very much in touch with the culture of Newfoundland. And on one of those trips, she ended up in Darka's living room while Andy was doing a puppet play with Darka. And since then, she's been sharing stories of these puppet plays for some time, and we've all had a fascination with the puppet plays and then what became the books, the Jack books by Andy Jones and Darka Erdelji. And so today, Teya is going to give us a talk on those books, and we'll have a broad discussion afterwards. I covered everything?
Okay. Thank you, Sue. All right, so my title, We Do Have Jack, Considering Contexts of the Jack series by Andy Jones and Darka Erdelji. The inspiration comes from an advertisement for a storytelling event in St. John's a few years back. And this was the poster. Oh, I'm sorry that it's cut off, but the advertising script that came with that poster lists all these story cycles from around the world, as you can see, and the advertisement concludes with, in Newfoundland, what have we got? Jack. I'm not sure how others, I'm now sure how others react to that title. For me, it really resonates with what my social studies lessons at McDonald Drive Junior High in 1970s St. John's taught me, which was that Newfoundland and Labrador is the have-not province, reliant on natural resources that were increasingly unimportant in the world. Some things do change over time, so Newfoundland is not as much of a have-not province as it used to be. But I think the joke is both a nod to that reputation as well as an assertion that Jack, the folktale hero, is a part of Newfoundland culture. So I'm here today to talk at some length, though not too long, about the series of books by Andy Jones and Darka Erdelji that follow the adventures of Jack, that folktale hero of 1,000 faces and adventures. It is a series that's been very well received with glowing reviews and many nominations and awards. Queen of Paradise's Garden, the first book, was named to the International Youth Library's White Ravens list. Shortlisted for the 2010 Bruno Family Award and the Newfoundland and Labrador Heritage and History Award. Jack and the Manger received the 2012 Bruno Family Award for Children's Young Adult Literature and was shortlisted for the 2012 Newfoundland Heritage and History Award. Jack and Mary and the Land of Thieves received the 2012 Winterset Award and the 2014 Bruno Family Award. And the most recent book, Jack, the King of Ashes, was shortlisted for the 2015 Anne Connor Brimmer Award. So people are noticing. By now, many of you have had an opportunity to hear Darka talk about her puppets, to see the puppet play, perhaps chatted with Andy or Darka or Marnie Parsons about the books. And so in some ways I feel a little bit superfluous. You know, why listen to an onlooker when you can get the scoop straight from, not to be too rude, the horses' mouths? That said, I do want to put the series in some different contexts, contexts of genre and of literary history, and consider what these contexts bring in terms of audience, of considerations of audience. Who do these books speak to and to what end? Most reviewers say the books are fun for the whole family, and I agree. That range of audience corresponds well with the folktale origins of these stories, since folktales are thought to have started in their earliest incarnations as tales told to all ages. The format of the books, however, with lots of pictures that have a folk or naive art style, but also somewhat cartoon style, really codes them as having a child audience, since we tend to associate or think of picture books and naive art as part of an addressing the child. Balancing that impression of child center, though, are the endnotes included in each book, detailing the sources drawn upon to create the stories. Those notes suggest an older audience, since we tend to think of children as not interested in background and that as an adult concern. We can talk also, though, with those endnotes about an educative purpose of these tales, which kind of brings us back to the suitable for all ages again. The stories are funny and entertaining, but they're also clearly connecting the audience with Newfoundland culture through the sources listed, the language used within the books, and the many allusions, both verbal allusions and visual allusions throughout these texts. At the same time, that focus on the Newfoundland culture is tempered by additions to the stories within the words, and also by elements of Darka's illustrations that pull away from strictly Newfoundland culture and place, putting the tales in a more global or transnational frame. There are plenty of elements to think about with this series, and I'm not going to cover everything that could be discussed. In fact, I had a hard time trimming down for this talk. My goal today is to explore some of the contexts of genre, purpose, and audience I see at work in these books. Before I start on the consideration of context, I'll take a few moments to introduce the series properly for those folks who may not yet have read any or all of the books. Though I use the word series, I should be very clear that the 4 books do not fit into a pattern we usually think of when we say series. They aren't like Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys. They are not like the Lemony Snicket books or Harry Potter, in that they don't follow one character keeping track of his adventures and building his life history. The series sticks to the model of Jack stories in folk culture. Jack is the main character, and in each story the characteristics of Jack are similar. Sometimes underestimated by others, often out to prove his worth, brave and bold, but sometimes a bit of a braggart, clever most of the time and always an adventurer once he gets going. But in each traditional Jack tale, it is as if we were meeting Jack for the first time. And this series sticks with that model. Though in Jack in the Manger, Andy plays just a little bit with that. When some 12 years after the birth of Jesus, which Jack has witnessed, I'll tell you more about that later. Jesus shows up again and asks Jack about his past. And on the way out, Jesus says, "Well, Jack," he says, I heard you climbed a beanstalk." No, that's totally exaggerated," says Jack. "But did you jump over a candlestick?" says Jesus. "Yes," says Jack, "I done that, and I shipped to a cat aboard a canoe for a year and a day. But that's a long story." These references to the best-known Jack tale, Jack and the Beanstalk, to a popular nursery rhyme, Jack Be Nimble, and to the Sheila's Brush production of Jack Meets the Cat, are the only acknowledgement, I think, of the other Jack tales or adventures in any of the books. The first of the books, The Queen of Paradise's Garden, sticks the closest, published in 2009, sticks the closest to the traditional tale that inspired it, using the title and following fairly closely the plot found in the two versions of the tale in Folk Tales of Newfoundland. Jack and his two brothers, Bill and Tom, set off to seek the magic fruit that can make their parents younger. Because Jack is kind and generous, he's helped along the way and gathers not only the fruit for his parents, but also wins the heart, amongst other things, of the Queen of Paradise. And marries her and lives happily ever after. The second in the series, Jack in the Manger from 2010, departs the most of the four from the traditional folk tale, working instead with another branch of the oral tradition, the Bible, and the stories surrounding the birth of the Christ child, taking some liberties here and there as Jack becomes a key player. Meeting Mary and meeting Mary and Joseph on the road to Bethlehem. And he's heading home to his community close to Bethlehem, the Mount of Pearls. He finds Mary and Joseph a place to stay and witnesses the birth of Jesus. And before he heads home, where, as I mentioned earlier, he meets up with Jesus 12 years later and gives him advice that will guide him in the future. During the course of this story, there's quite a bit of commentary on the sort of storytelling that surrounds Christ's birth, and I'm afraid that's a bit I had to cut because I just had no room. This very funny discussion of reality and fantasy going on there. And there are many, many jokes about Newfoundland, and particularly references to the St. John's area. The third book, Jack and Mary in the Land of Thieves, from 2012, returns to Newfoundland folktale tradition, using the tale Jack and the Slave Islands with other sources mixed in. Jack runs away with Mary, a clever baker and businesswoman whose father doesn't want her to marry him. They marry, and with the clever albino mynah bird, Baxter, they make a home and create a thriving fishing and baking business in the Land of Thieves. During the course of this, their wealth attracts the attention of Mauvais Cudahy, who, as his first name suggests, is a bad man. He tricks Jack into believing Mary has been unfaithful and takes all their money and businesses, carrying Jack away to the Slave Islands and leaving Mary to fend for herself. She makes her way in the world and, being clever and resourceful, ends up the captain of her own ship, sailing the world to save Jack and Baxter. After she finds him, Jack, and tests his love, they reunite and have a long, happy life with a yaffle of youngsters that Jack stays home to care for while Mary captains her ship around the world. The final book, just out this past fall, is Jack the King of Ashes, and it continues the focus on partnerships. This Jack starts off a rather useless young man who won't get out of his coal box till his mother finally gets him a dog, Kevin Fawns, who motivates Jack to step outside of the box and head out to find the missing princess. After falling in love with the princess and then tricking a bunch of robbers who had kidnapped her, Jack is tricked by the nefarious Captain Muldoon, who wants the princess for himself. Oops, I'm sorry. Who wants the princess for himself and sets Jack afloat in a jolly boat with no paddles, no oars. Through some supernatural help, Jack makes his way to the princess, and after some magical adventures and shenanigans of various sorts, they have a big wedding and everybody is happy. So those are the 4 books. In making these summaries, I've had to leave out a lot of funny allusions, great jokes, complicated twists and turns, particularly the twists and turns for the last 2 books. The stories have gotten more complex as the series has progressed, involving references to and elements from a variety of sources. Also, at this point, I've yet to talk about the pictures, which are an integral part of these books. This is where perhaps we can start talking about genre. For these books belong to a variety of genres, and the one that will stand out first to the casual observer is that they look like picture books. And in fact, they are picture books, in that they are filled with pictures that connect with the verbal or written texts, in some cases illustrating the incidents the verbal text relates, in other cases expanding upon or adding to the stories. This consideration of form brings us to some literary history within children's literature. The picture book in the form we know it is a relatively recent development. First emerging in the late 19th century. Within the larger category of picture book, there are many variations on the form, with different ratios of pictures to words and differing functions of pictures and words. From no words at all, with the pictures telling all of the story, to a great many words with just a few pictures illustrating or enhancing the story. I find Yuri Shulavitz's discussion of picture books and storybooks helpful in thinking about how pictures and words work together. In his article, What is a Picture Book?, Shulavitz, an author, illustrator, and Caldecott Medal winner, discusses the difference between a picture book in which without the pictures, the words have little meaning or story, and the storybook in which the words carry the story, which can be fully understood without the pictures. Now, we've got some arguments with his idea, but this idea that there are these 2 functions is important. The example of picture book he gives is Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, in which the words establish really the skeleton of the story, but the pictures flesh out the story. And so at the beginning of Where the Wild Things Are, which I'm sure everybody knows, or did know at some point in their life, the night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind and another, we really wouldn't know what kind of mischief Max makes without the pictures. And that becomes important for later in the story because the kind of mischief he makes ties in with what happens to him later. So the pictures are really fundamentally important there. The other book that Shulavitz mentions as the example of a storybook is The Tale of Peter Rabbit. And Shulavitz asserts that with that story, you really can understand the story without the pictures. And I'm not sure I entirely agree with him. You can understand a story, but if you take the pictures out, you lose a little something. And this is my favorite picture in the story because you may remember that Peter Rabbit is warned by his mother not to go to Mr. McGregor's garden or else he'll be made into a rabbit pie like his father. This is the end of the story where Peter's made it successfully home out of that garden. But notice as he lies supine on the floor there, as the words tell us, we've got all the ingredients for a rabbit pie right there. So Potter was a little sly in her illustrations. In any case, but this idea that we've got these different kinds of ways that picture books can work is an important one to I think, keep in mind as we think about what is the function that we see in the books we're looking at. In the case of the Jack series, the books are, I think, storybooks rather than picture books, because the words carry so much of the story. But we can look for the ways in which the pictures both illustrate events and characters, such as when the evil Captain Muldoon sets Jack afloat, or in Jack, the King of the Ashes, or the characterization of Jack and his brothers in the Queen of Paradise's garden. Jack, Mary, and Joseph gravel pit camping in Jack and the Manger. Jack and Mary and who they are in Jack and Mary in the Land of Thieves. Or Jack and a ghost helping him in Jack, the King of Ashes. The pictures also enhance the stories the words tell, often with little stories that aren't conveyed by the words, such as throughout the Queen of Paradise's garden, there are 3 little birds who echo Jack's actions or pick up on Jack's actions and magnify them. And so there's the 3 little birds who match Jack, Bill, and Tom in that first story. We also, in Jack and the Manger, there are the birds who gather the gumballs. Gather the gumballs throughout the story, and they're a little side narrative that we keep an eye on. In the 2 later books, there are decorations and embellishments that add fun games to the margins, such as instructions for making a paper airplane in Jack and Mary in the Land of Thieves. Other embellishments add movement, such as the lines that we see in Jack, the King of Ashes, encouraging us to follow actions and think about them. And they also create resonances within the main storyline, as with the illustrations of different puppets. I've lost something there. Of different puppets. There are a number of sketches of different styles of puppet show throughout the King of Ashes towards the end. So we've got these illustrations performing these different functions throughout the stories. That these Jack stories fit more into a storybook mode is not surprising. Even the most densely illustrated folktale retellings often do. We can think of well-known picture book versions of folktales. Paul Zelinsky's... Oh, there they are. Sorry. These are the rest of the puppets. So Paul Zelinsky's gone missing, but Nancy Elcombe Burkhart's Snow White, very richly, lushly illustrated folktale. Trina Sharp-Hyman's Little Red Riding Hood. And the Ladybird versions of Cinderella, for example. These pictures are beautiful and lush. They enhance our visions of the characters and events. There's even a lush version of a Jack tale originating from Newfoundland, adapted by Janet McNaughton, illustrated by Susan Tooke. The book is a beautiful book. But for my money, the smaller scale and more integrated designs of Darka's illustrations better fit with the scrappy, feisty nature of the folktales and the folktale characters that inspired these books. And we should take a moment right now just to acknowledge Veselina Tomova's design work for the layout of all 4 books, which creates their integrated nature and the pacing of the books as well. The pictures also maintain the feeling of folktale in the Jack books as taking place not in this world. The illustrations of those lusher varieties tend to emphasize reality, this world, sometimes giving them a historical setting, such as Zelinsky's Rapunzel, which really plays with the Renaissance painting and that sense of history, or Trina Sharp-Hyman's Little Red Riding Hood, which does the 19th century feel, quite emphasizes that feel. We've also got in these other kinds of books making the setting very realistic. which is what Susan Took does with the jack tale. And I find this one a difficult picture. I don't know if anybody else does, because Jack looks so odd in his jacket against, an outport scene that I've stood in. So it's an odd, it's an odd juxtaposition, I find. And it's the realism that I think is the problem here. With the pictures in the Jack books, we get the feel of Newfoundland through the landscape. I think the colors, the greens and the blues that show up, the little sketches and the sense of how the houses fit into the landscape, the grays and the purples also, for me, really evoke the sense of Newfoundland rather than the strict reality of Newfoundland. And in that way, they really, instead of dealing with particulars, they capture an essence, and they resemble, in many ways, traditional tales in terms of setting. So William Bascombe, an American folklorist and anthropologist, wrote in 1965 an article called Forms of Folklore, Prose Narratives, and he defines myth, legend, and folk tale in relation to each other in terms of how they are perceived, their purpose, and their setting. Of setting in particular, Bascombe says, folk tales may be set in any time and any place, and in this sense they are almost timeless and placeless. And he contrasted that with myths, which are before time, and legends, which have some sort of historical connection. I'm not sure that the pictures in the Jack book are entirely timeless. The clothing and homes suggest sort of 19th century. And there are, besides the allusions to landscape and architecture that remind us of Newfoundland, a few maps just to make sure we get the point. So, that first one is from the Queen of Paradise's garden, obviously, and this one is from Jack and Mary in the Land of Thieves. The map from Jack and Mary corresponds to the verbal text in which we are told that the Land of Thieves became Newfoundland, a point that reminds us of the island's colonial past. We can think about the landlords who took as much advantage of the fishing families and the liviers as they could, or we can think of those who settled illegally on the island in its earlier history. However we interpret what the stories tell us, the map reinforces the connection, one of the ways pictures in storybooks work. Words and pictures are a team in these books, even if the words carry the majority of the actual narrative. The design of the books, with the pictures integrated with the words, furthers that sense of teamwork, suggesting to readers that they read both pictures and words together. The lack of big, lush pictures and the large amount of written text can lead, however, to people questioning these Jack stories as children's books. So, about 3 years ago, I submitted an essay to a journal talking about the Queen of... the essay talked about the Queen of Paradise's garden, and I submitted that to a journal. And they sent it off to reviewers, and I got the report back from those reviewers. Both were very positive about it and felt it should be published, but one reviewer said, this is not the right article for this journal, which was a journal of children's literature and culture. The reviewer felt that it wasn't so much the content of the story that was the problem, but rather the format of the book made the reviewer question its audience. The design, the small press run of the book, and even the press that produced it were factors that that reviewer felt suggested it was an art object, more suited for book collectors than for children. Implied throughout the comments seemed to be the idea that the format of the book did not fit into a concept of picture books that appeal to children. To be honest, I'm not clear why art books can't also be children's books. And I will say that the article got published, so this was not something the editors were worried about at all. But if I was going to argue that any of the Jack books were not children's books, I'd focus on the predominance of words in the books, which does not fit with the idea of the age group for whom picture books are thought to be suitable. the 2 to 5-year-old set. I would then counter that argument that many children at that stage of 2 to 5 get their initial literary experiences from being read to, in which the sound of the story and lots of interesting small pictures on a single page are just as appealing, if not maybe more so, than large format pictures with small amounts of written text. So let's just say that these books are children's books, but in keeping with theories of children's literature, we can also see the possibilities for more than one audience. Any number of theorists tell us that children's literature always speaks to at least 2 audiences, the child audience and the adult audience. But in many cases, I think that point overgeneralizes the possibilities. Within these 2 categories determined by age, there are a number of other possible audience demographics. We can think about the biggies of gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, culture, and nationality as examples. Given the focus of this symposium and of the books themselves, I'm going to focus on culture and nationality. Who do these books speak to if we think about international, national, and regional contexts? At this point, I'm going to conflate audience with context in general and think about how these books fit into each of those contexts: international, national, and regional. So the Jack series is a part of a long international tradition of folktale production and conveyance. The genealogy includes Charles Perrault, the Brothers Grimm, Asbjornsen and Moe, Joseph Jacobs, and Hans Christian Andersen, if we think pre-20th century. And it also includes many writers and illustrators who during the 20th century turned folktales into picture books, such as Paul Goldoni and Wanda Gog. The motivations of these various writers and artists for recording and rewriting traditional tales varied. Of all the folktale collectors I mentioned, Perrault, Grimm, Asbjornsen and Moe from Norway, and Joseph Jacobs from England were really recorders and rewriters of folktales. Hans Christian Andersen is something a little bit different, and I'll get to that in a moment. Nearly all of those recorders and rewriters had cultural or nationalist motivations for collecting and writing those tales. They wanted to make sure that the folktales of their country were recorded for posterity and disseminated as part of a national identity. The Grimms are perhaps best known for this drive, and they influenced the later Asbjornsen and Moe and Joseph Jacobs. Perrault's collection of fairy tales predate the Grimm's collections and also kind of predate Romanticism, which underpins all of this. But his recordings do connect with a literary argument that was going on, which he was very much part of, called the Battle of the Ancients and the Moderns, in which, among the elements debated, included a sense that France's native literary productions had as much value as the productions of the great Greek and Roman cultures. That's what they were duking it out about. In preserving and valuing what were seen as artifacts and purveyors of particular cultures, these writers succeeded in making folktales part not only of national but also international discourse, bringing them to a huge geographical and historical audience. Of the tales, Jack tales by Andy and Darka, 3 of them fit well into this paradigm. The Queen of Paradise's Garden, Jack and Mary in the Land of Thieves, and Jack, the King of Ashes, all take tales with roots in European tradition, but collected in a particular place, Newfoundland, and they work to bring them to a regional and national audience with a certain amount of national motive, if we think of Newfoundland as a nation, which many do. In doing so, these tales are also available to a much larger audience, to an international audience. And in fact, I found Jack, the King of Ashes listed on Swedish, Dutch, South African book selling sites, as well as on Amazon.com, Amazon.uk, and Wonder of Wonders, Amazon.ca. Truly some international coverage. Of course, what these picture books do is take and tweak work done by collectors who traveled throughout Newfoundland in the 1960s, recording them. And in the preface to Folk Tales of Newfoundland, Carl Lindahl, who was the general editor for Garland Publishers, refers to Herbert Halpert and John Widdowson, the editors of the collection, as a team in the tradition of the Grimms and Asbjornsen and Moe. So perhaps we should see them as the recorders who bring tales to an international stage. However, the Grimms and the rest of that crowd also popularized their national tales. And while Folk Tales of Newfoundland is a collection well known to folklorists and many Newfoundlanders, it's not made much of an impression on a wider audience. The Jack books take what are sometimes really difficult texts to read. Has anybody else here tried to read the originals? I should have brought a sample, because they're fascinating, but they are orthographic. I mean, they're trying to capture, is that the right word? They're trying to capture with phonetic symbols and with descriptions what was happening as the story was being told. It's a little hard to read. And so what Andy's work with the tales does is really far closer to what the Grimms did with their subsequent editions of their tales, making them a little easier to read, a little more literary, a little more suited to the audience they realized they had for these tales. I would also say that his motivation, Andy's motivation, is a little closer to the Grimms as well. With Halpert and Widdowson, there was really some sense of preserving and disseminating Newfoundland culture, but they were also really, really interested in sort of talking to folklorists about ways of storytelling and traditions in a way that's very scholarly. They don't speak to a mainstream audience. And I think they were aware of it, at least Widdowson was aware of it, because he later published a collection of Jack tales rewritten to make them more accessible to a general reading audience. So in following the lead of the Grimms and others by making the stories accessible to a wider audience, Andy continues an international tradition while also following his own tradition of supporting and advocating for Newfoundland culture. I've left to one side Hans Christian Andersen, whose motivations were not particularly nationalist, but who does have, and did during his lifetime have, an international profile. Andersen's work is a bit different from the other folktale figures I've discussed because, although steeped in the oral tradition, his most famous stories belong to the category of literary tale. The distinction is a fine one, but literary tales tend to be longer and more detailed, more literary than folk tales, usually the invention of the author. So they may have elements that come from the oral tradition, but there's no original oral version of the story being told. 3 of the Jack books, as I mentioned earlier, are based on specific tales, with the Queen of Paradise's Garden being the closest to an original tale from the oral collection, while the last 2 of the books stretch and move more towards the literary tale. Jack in the Manger, I think, is the closest to a literary tale, though. While the basic elements do belong to the biblical tradition, so really international, of the 4 books, it's also the most of its time, its place, and author. It's the one that has the most in-jokes. Although the setting is ostensibly the area around Bethlehem, it is clear that really it's set in Newfoundland in around St. John's. The opening of the story, with its background on Caesar Augustus's need to take a census, makes jokes about calling people home or out working in the oil fields, reminding us of course, Alberta, but these are the olive oil fields of Egypt that all the people are coming home from. And it refers to thus creating the first come home year, a tradition that's been going on off and on in Newfoundland since the 1960s. So Jack lives in the Mount of Pearls outside of Bethlehem, about which the narrator comments, now, some people just call it the Pearl, but anyway, that's neither here nor there, much like the pearl. I expect anyone who lives in a city with a smaller city on its fringes can identify with this making fun of the smaller city. But for people from the St. John's area, this is a reference to the towny mocking of Mount Turl as a bedroom community of St. John's. Particularly since Jack has a basement apartment there in the Pearl, yeah. Jack tries in vain to get lodgings at the Bethlehem Hotel on Fair Mountain, a joke about the Hotel Newfoundland, which is now a Sheraton but was formerly a Fairmont Hotel. And in the final conversation with Joseph and Mary, as Jack teases them a little bit, in the background is a picture reminiscent of the Basilica of St. John the Baptist, which is, of course, a prominent feature of downtown St. John's. My point here is that while anyone can enjoy this story, it speaks particularly to the local audience with jokes and references specific to that area. All of the books have this quality of speaking to Newfoundlanders in varying degrees, with the form of the language in particular, but in other ways as well. I'm going to call these references and these texts national, for I think underlying them is a nationalist motivation, as I said, found in folktale collecting. I made this point in the article I mentioned previously, and I got into a little bit of a snarl with the line editor at the end of the process, who was convinced that as long as I was referring to Newfoundland, I should use the terms provincial or regional, since national always meant Canadian. And I won't say the sorts of things I yelled when I read these comments, but I just kept thinking, Central Canadian, I didn't back down in that case. I wrote lengthy notes about why it should not be changed. And I'm prepared here, though, to qualify the point just a little bit, because I think we can also speak of cultural group. So nationalist or cultural group. The Jack books reflect a desire to speak of and to a particular cultural group, something that is a part of a trend in folktale picture books dealing with lesser-known folktales, those not from the mainstream European tradition. I've found over the years that picture book versions of folktales are an important production of groups who want to reinforce their group identity. So, for example, African American artists who make a point of illustrating African and African American folktales. Or, as I found over the past few years, I've been on a committee for a Mexican American Children's Literature Book Award, and every year we have at least 2 or 3 picture books that are folktales from Mexico or South America as part of that reinforcing cultural identity. It's all part of the sense that folktales and folk traditions capture or embody important cultural elements and thus important aspects of cultural identity. But isn't that a rather romantic notion? A notion that sees authentic identity as belonging somewhere in the past before industrialization and urbanization disconnected people from nature and their own specific places? Certainly part of the scholarly conversation about identity in Atlantic Canada is a debate about where tourism, about the debate about tourism and how it uses the past, including the folk past, as a way of marketing the place, to some extent to the detriment of the contemporary culture, the people who live in the place now. James Overton expressed that view in 1988 in his article, A Newfoundland Culture. And in an interview with Herb Weil, Edward Rich comments that on tourism, I think tourism is a kind of pollution. It is a terrible thing. And as something that one has to rely on for economic survival, it is the last act of desperation. No one comes to Newfoundland to see what the future might hold for this place. So you are the custodians of a past and you're sort of bound to it as if you're clinging to tourism or if you're servicing tourism. So I think the cultural impact is retarding. One could argue that this series of Jack books buys into that same romanticism that underpins tourism in the region and somehow does a disfavor to what Newfoundland has become in the 21st century. However, I know the intention behind these tales did not belong along those lines, and I would argue that neither do the stories. Andy, in his speech at Memorial University of Newfoundland when he received an honorary doctorate, commented particularly on Newfoundland culture and tourism. And I'll just draw your attention to the last bit here, where he's talking about the value of the folk traditions and what is part of Newfoundland's background. And he finishes by saying, let's see. It was generated by human beings together in our complex, evolved, and still very dynamic Newfoundland culture, nurtured by the people of Newfoundland in institutions such as the university and the school system. And the art that comes from that culture should be available to our own people first and later on for tourists. These Jack tales, with some in-crowd jokes and with in-notes that point people to the resources Andy used in writing the stories, are, I think, meant to speak to our own people first. But they also combine the old Newfoundland and the new Newfoundland. The tales support the tourist idea of Newfoundland, a quaint place full of folk tales, sayings, and dialect, and simultaneously undermine them, resisting that impulse, both in the pictures and with the words. These books are a bit sly. They present a look back, but at the same time they speak clearly to the issues and debates that are contemporary. The pictures are of Newfoundland, but also of Darka's Eastern European roots. That combination creates a transnational world for the tales, echoing Darka's experiences, as well as Newfoundland's long history as a place where many cultures met, and the global nature of our world today. The stories put the boot to the neoliberal notion of every person for themselves and profit no matter what the cost, with Jack's generosity to others as key to his success in The Queen of Paradise's Garden, and in the depictions of Mauvaise Cudahy in Jack and Mary in The Land of Thieves and Captain Muldoon in Jack the King of Ashes. These are people who abuse power and ultimately are overcome and undone. Challenges to prescribe traditional gender roles is another aspect, most notably in Jack and Mary in The Land of Thieves, with Mary being the successful captain and Jack staying home to raise the children. Of course, such challenges to hierarchical power and to gender norms are part of the original tradition. These are things that are in the original stories. Tales that were collected in the 1960s and first heard by many of the storytellers in 1920s and 30s, thought to come from 19th century storytellers. And this point about this sort of continuity, that this material is there, just being pulled out for us to see in the Jack books, should be a warning to us to be very careful about seeing a complete break between the folk past of Atlantic Canada and its present. Tucked within the oldest stories are these unchanging elements of society. George Story, in his 1976 essay Notes from the Berry Patch, pointed to the importance of the folk traditions to understanding and identifying a Newfoundland literature. And in this subsequent century of literary production, as Herb points out in Anne of Tim Hortons, what contemporary Atlantic Canadian literature makes clear is that fiddles and shopping malls, lobsters and satellite dishes can and do happily coexist. While on the surface the Jack books do not consciously set up binaries of past and present, they are there in the level of issues and ideas and available for us to think about. In conclusion, and I know you're ready, the Jack series speaks to me in that they reflect a reality of being from Newfoundland. All the Jacks have to leave home. They have to travel to find success. And as part of the Newfoundland diaspora myself, these stories resonate because Jack does indeed find success. And at the end of Jack and the King of Ashes, or as that book suggests, wherever Jack ends up, he can also be surrounded by friends, old and new, and family, blending the international and the national as Newfoundland does. Looking at these three possible contexts for Andy and Darka's series, folktale picture books, folktale collecting and dissemination, and discussions of regional literature and culture, show us both the continuities with and the departures from these contexts by these books. They speak to many audiences in many ways, the hallmark of fine literature. They bridge the past and the present, And particularly with the illustrations that reflect different folk traditions and places, they reflect the transnational global nature of Newfoundland. And let's face it, Atlantic Canada as a whole. It may be that Canada east of New Brunswick still thinks, oh no, west of New Brunswick, excuse me. A little disoriented here. It may be that Canada west of New Brunswick still thinks of this region as have-not, but this fine series of books demonstrates that we do indeed got Jack. Are we going to have questions?
See, I told her it was going to be wonderful. Oh, the best part, I mean, I have to say that all this Jack business is really because of Teya, who gave me the book in the first place. And then I thought, oh, this is so good, I must teach it. And then Marnie has been wonderful about bringing the books, and then I thought, oh, but I really want to see this puppet play after reading your article, and anyway, it's gone and on. So to me, this is a wonderful convergence, and actually when Teya's proposal came in, she said, I realize it's kind of too much for a proposal, you know, how am I going to fit this into 20 minutes? But I had already had the thought that really I should give her more time so that we could, you know, have this whole thing, and so you've done a wonderful job.
Thank you.
And to the students in the room, I wanted to sort of follow up on something that Sue said, which is just to offer a little encouragement, and I'll also tell you the story of our first conference presentation, the three of us together. So it's also fun that we're all at a conference again, sort of presenting together. It was in 1995. We went to Chicago. The feature of that particular conference was Canadian women. It was at the Popular Culture Association. So we dutifully each presented a paper on something to do with Canadian women in children's literature. Now, can you get any more marginal, do you think? So we were placed in the last session of the last day. Guess who came to our panel? Our chair. So the moderator. Yeah. So we're very happy to have a much bigger audience who's truly enthusiastic. And now I'm going to open the floor to questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so I'm sure
or
you have
evisceration
some.
Or whatever. Oh, here we go. Okay.
Well, first of all, Teya, thank you for a delightful paper, delightful series. Picking up on your comments about various characteristics of Darka's illustrations, so you talked about layout and color, but it struck me that, looking at the pictures, what really strikes me is the playing around with like proportion and perspective and scale. Yeah. Think about reading that narrative with all due apologies, with the illustrations in the mode of, the one you were complaining about, that outport.
Right. Super realistic.
Sort of rigidly proportioned. And to me, that would be very discordant. So I'm just wondering if you have any reflections on the role of proportion, scale.
I think the first thing I thought of as you were mentioning that was that another thing I couldn't fit into this paper was talking about the way in which Darka's art just, for me, calls all sorts of other artists into mind. And Sue and Andrea and another person I was talking to all said, Chagall is in here somewhere, yeah? And I wanted to talk about Cubism, and maybe, there's some cows in the background in a couple of pictures that just make me think about Picasso. And so that's one of the things that I think these illustrations do. You do find them in other folktale picture books. I'm not thinking of anybody in particular at this point, but I think they really fit much better what the folk tales do than that super realistic style that's really much more popular, I think, generally speaking, in the mainstream. Because the folk tales are out of proportion. When you think about the characterizations, they're just wacky often. And so, I think that's a whole other paper with lots more illustrations and pictures of artists and things like that. Yeah. Anything else?
Just as a follow on that, I was thinking of Mireya Mircea Eliade talks about in illo tempore,
Right.
that once upon a time, that other non-historical time, that the illustrations cut us loose, just as the folktales do, cut us loose from time and place.
Right.
And it's somewhere else where these dimensions and proportions, and both Andy and Darka do that in the Jack Tales. We're floating in that imaginative space.
Yeah, which I think is what William Bascombe is getting at, but he's writing in this mid-60s, and I'm trying to remember, Eliade was he was about mid-20th century that he was really talking about, and Joseph Campbell is getting really important at that point as well, and so there's that's a whole other paper also, just how this fits into those ideas. Yeah.
And there's also scale and dimension within the illustrations themselves. There's all these little people, sometimes in larger landscapes, sometimes in smaller landscapes, and sometimes you have, the female characters in particular who are huge, and they're being cut off. They're bursting the bounds of the page. And so I love the way, Darka, that you do that. You bring us down to a smaller level. No.
We're all verklempt. Martin says we're all verklempt right now.
How can we go normal life now?
But I love the way that you do that. You push your characters out of the box that they're in, and then you bring them down tiny again, and it's all part of the narrative.
Which brings up a certain element of Tales of Cthulhu in various productions, which are the same type of part of the mother is cut off, and Cthulhu is a grown man in a crib, and this is perfectly normal in the context of the story. But what I'm interested in is the two-person aspect of the books, in that the child who possibly can't read the book, who's 4 or 5 at Leo's, is being read to by usually an elder sister or a babysitter who's 12 or 13. And so that the 12 or 13-year-old is captured by the words, and the child is captured by the pictures, and they are both enjoying the same book.
Yeah. Though it's interesting, some of the discussions about children's literature and that process of the read aloud and what's important, some of the discussions suggest that for younger children, while they do enjoy the pictures, the oral is really important, that sound of the voice, and I don't know how many people had parents or babysitters who did the voices for the things. I mean, there's a whole element there also. But yeah, you're right. I mean, they offer lots of different texts for lots of different people. Yeah.
Kind of try to follow that rhythmus of the Andy's writing with the pictures. So try to coming together sometimes, and then follow this in another direction and make parallel stories, which kind of weaving together at certain points and falling slowly apart and have their own lives, but connecting in certain very important points. So I think that
the rhythm,
of telling visually and telling, I'm really trying to do that. I don't know how much is seen.
That's a whole nother paper. We'll be talking about those rhythms, the rhythms of the voice storytelling and the rhythms of the visual storytelling. And that's where I think also talking about Vasilina's part in your process would be fascinating in terms of arranging what a page looks like, so that those rhythms you talk about and those stories that go off and then come back, how they show up in the books. It's all very fascinating, I think. Yeah.
Like the storytellers from Herbert Hopwood and John Woodison's book. And I read, and it is hard to read those sometimes.
Yeah.
But I read them hundreds of times, not the whole book, but and I really love books, particularly Freeman Bennett from from the west coast, which is the French shore,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where the English, Irish, and French come together.
Right.
They're the best storytellers in many ways.
Yeah.
But his rhythm is, and he does, the way you just build a bridge from one part of the world to the other part of the world is like the way he pushes the story together.
Right.
Really fast. It just jumps right in. It just jumps to the next thing.
Right.
And that's, I really, when I'm writing the books, I'm always trying to get through it all the way, just get him there.
Right. Right.
And it's like a modern film, it's like, you know, you
The
just
cuts and-
cut to, cut.
Yeah, right. Right. That point, though, about the different, the Folktales of Newfoundland is a really interesting treasure trove because it's sometimes the same story from 4 or 5 different storytellers from different parts of the island. And as Andy says, the rhythms of their storytelling vary so much. Details will vary also. And so all of that creates the same story that's different each time. And it's quite
They're
fascinating.
the most amazing books
Yeah.
in the world.
Yeah.
Technically, we're out of time, but I'm going to let it go another 5 minutes because we have an hour and a half for lunch. So,
Yeah,
who needs lunch? Well, we'll
Oh,
have
I
a
don't know.
little-
I suspect
There's
some
a
of us will
little
need
flex
lunch.
time. So, I saw many hands. David? And then Wanda.
I was really interested in the Anderson comparison
Mm-hmm.
because, I mean, he wrote some very bitter, angry tales, and they were sort of sanctified and cleaned up. I was
Right.
in Denmark in 2006 for the national celebration of his death. And
Right.
his hands everywhere, cleaned up and clarified. And by the end of the year, Copenhagen was featuring cabarets titled, "Look, no hands." Resistance to enough already.
Right.
Part of it was because it lacked throughout its retelling a sort of self-awareness, which it strikes me in these books, well, particularly the performance yesterday. There's a self-awareness and parody within them that sort of acts as an automatic defense against, don't take all of this too seriously. It was there in Andy's performance yesterday when he turns from old blind Pew into young.
Right.
Young, but he was obviously sort of inviting the audience to play with that sense of, I'm sort of promoting my own youth here, whatever the evidence suggests. Is that is that persistently through the books? It's obviously in the performance, this self-awareness. Do the books carry this sense of protect? You know what I'm saying.
I think I do know what you're saying. And I think that this is interesting because the interviews that Andre and I did with, and Vivian did with Andy and Darka a couple years ago, it feels like now, but on Thursday. I just lost my thread. Hang on. Andy talked about the process of the narrator, who the narrator is in these books. And that, for at least one of the books, Marnie said, you got to get the narrator, you're getting lost here. Get the narrator. There is a distinction between what the characters say and what the narrator says and how the narrator says things. And the narrator is quite a self-aware narrator. I'm being a literature person, I want to pull apart Andy and the narrator and say, the narrator in these books, or narrators in these books, yeah, they are, and they're this sort of sly side asides and things like that. That, and the little in jokes and the puns and those do sort of take us, don't necessarily pull us out of the story unless we're kind of open to that. So it's both there, but it's also effaced a little bit. Yeah.
The hands, no hands. When I was in BDI a bunch of years ago, they were doing Frankenstein.
Yes.
Okay, so Wanda and then Lee.
I'll try to be really quick. It just struck me, the more I saw the illustrations, that Unger, they seemed reminiscent of that, and at the risk of admitting that we do more than read, Netflix had a documentary, and it may still be there, on his life.
Right.
And just the darkness of his childhood and his kind of graphic training and everything. And he actually spent some time in Nova Scotia. Surprise, surprise. So,
I didn't know that.
There was something about the illustrations that, and so I don't know, those of you who are more versed in this connection might explore that connection with the European influences.
I was thinking about that yesterday with the Beaver Dime discussion of the two brothers or two fellows. Husband and wife, okay, from Czechoslovakia originally. And, you know, thinking about the influence of Eastern European book illustrators on North American children's picture books in particular, and children's art. Tommy Unger is one of them. But it seems to me there are so many more that we could talk about. And I'm blanking on names right now, but yeah, Peter Sees would be another one. There's another paper.
Soon you're going to be writing.
What?
You're ready.
Yeah, it's exhausting.
We know what your next book is.
Yeah.
Lee.
I just wondered about the challenge of creating legends, of creating new legends. I don't know if this book still has resonance in Newfoundland, and that is Ellen Obed's book called Borrowed Black.
Oh yeah.
Has it lasted?
It has lasted. In fact, it's been republished with new illustrations. What year was that? Because it came out in 70-something originally, and then it was reissued in the late 80s. And I still am seeing that in the bookstores, you know, in various places. And I stumbled across it. I stumbled across a reference to that in some article or something from nowhere near this part of the world. So it is, yeah, so it's spread.
Darka made a puppet show of that.
Did you?
Yeah, both, and people sit on the boat.
They did it.
Oh.
And the point was that they are like on the sea, and they,
Right.
I don't know how many of you know the story is really beautiful.
It
They're
is
on
beautiful.
the sea, and you don't know, there is a wind, or it's like a voice. And we put together French version and English version because it's repeating. So we make like this, like echoes of the wind. And so people sit, and there was these shadows all around you, and you doesn't know if they really come if they're a wolf, or it's the bear watch you, or it's like just like, I don't know, a shadow. Or so everything was very mood kind.
Yes,
It's
creates the
really
mood of
beautiful
it.
book, so if
Yeah.
anybody is interested, it's like wow, it's like it's a poetry. Like it's like a wind comes through the book. Like and it's all this north and cold and howling the wolves and everything is there. It's like you're on the sea and you just go through this.
Atmospheric.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She wrote it in a motel room over Ellen. Obed told me this, in a motel room over a weekend when she was locked in the blizzard in New Brunswick.
Oh dear. Well, it's got legs. Yeah. Yeah.
It was published in 88.
Good.
Originally 79, republished in 88.
Sound not too bad.
Illustrations, oh, is it Jan or Jan?
I think it's Jan, but I'm not sure.
Jan, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I might suggest we call it to a close. I would invite any people who have come from the public to join us for lunch, if you like, because I think there will be enough food. It's on the 3rd floor, in the 3rd floor lounge. I'm designating Herb Weil the leader, because I never seem to get to the meals quite on time, as you have recognized. So it's just, you go up the stair, and you need a key card to get in, and he has one. So you just take the stairs up here by the, you can take the elevator if you need to, and then it'll be a bit of a maze finding your way. But basically, when you get to the 3rd floor, you go through the glass doors, and it's the first door on your left.
Can we leave stuff in this room?
This room will not be locked, so I wouldn't leave anything valuable, but I would say notes and that sort of thing, you're perfectly fine to leave.
If anyone wants
So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
What did you want to say?
Oh gosh.